Hello. I wanted to start our second lesson with another quote. This one's a bit longer. It's that solving the population problem is not going to solve the problems of racism, of sexism, of religious intolerance, of war, of gross economic inequality. But if you don't solve the population problem, you're not going to solve any of those problems. Whatever problem you're interested in, you're not going to solve it unless you also solve the population problem. Whatever your cause, it's a lost cause without population control. And that quote was from Paul Ehrlich in 1996. There was a video produced called The Population Bomb, and population growth, especially human population growth and overpopulation, has been a large source of debate and drama for centuries. The Greek people even talked about limiting reproduction to keep their population size under control. There was a famous essay written by Thomas Malthus on population growth because he was noticing that people, and this is a graph of his ideas, people were growing exponentially. But food production was only growing arithmetically, and so he pointed out that at some point there's going to be a crisis point where there is more people than food can support. And so this population problem is one of many ethical questions we're going to run across in biology. Do we have the right to tell other people how many children they can have? Are you personally morally obligated to consider everyone on the planet when you choose to start a family? It's a really interesting, complicated problem, but let's just start talking about populations. First of all, why are we studying the population level of ecology at all? Well, that leads us to the first big idea, and that is that populations share genes. They are breeding as part of a gene pool. So we're assuming that any member of the species within that population could choose to breed with another member and thus possibly pass those genes down to their offspring. So anything local that's going on might only affect the traits of that population and not every member of the species on the planet. As we're thinking about populations, you need to remember the second big idea, which is that you can't change just one thing. All of these local changes are going to affect other species, which will affect other species, which will affect other species. It's a big ripple effect that's going to go throughout the biosphere. So starting at the population level and watching for healthy populations is a good way to kind of monitor our overall ecosystems. So we can understand things like what threats there are to certain species, which populations are stable, which are growing, which are declining, and how, this is a big one, how introduced species, so those non-native species that tend to be brought to a new place either on purpose or by accident, how those affect native species. And we have a lot of these. The first, in America, the first to come to mind is, the pythons in the Everglades that are so big now they can eat entire deer. That's a problem. That is definitely something we want to monitor. A lot of these questions have to do with population size, but size all by itself can be misleading, so we'll often use something called population density, and that is just the number of organisms or individuals of a species divided by the unit area, or sometimes we're considering volume with our marine animals, even bacteria in a culture. When scientists are sampling populations, they almost never count every individual. They're going to count either a small set and do random plot sampling, so they'll have many small plots within a larger area, and then they'll calculate based on the size of the plots and the overall size of the area. They'll get an estimate of the individuals in that area, or they'll do a mark recapture method where they capture a set and tag a set of individuals of one species, and then they'll mark them in some way. release them, and later on go back and catch a second sample. And so what they'll do, there's a quick formula for this. They take the number that they have captured on the second go around that are marked, divided by the total number that they captured the second time, and that should be equal to the number they marked and captured the first time divided by the total number in the population, and so in this case that would be 30. Another method that's really good, especially when you're looking for very rare species, is remote sensing. There is a group that goes out from my alma mater, Furman University, looking for cougars, and so this is actually a bobcat that they caught a photo of on one of their remote sensing cameras. I love it because the bobcat's looking at the camera, checking the camera out, trying to figure out what's going on. Another thing to consider when you're looking at populations and trying to get an idea of what kind of sampling method you're going to use, it's a good idea to know how that population typically disperses itself within its habitat. And so that can be uniform, or sometimes that's called even. You see this a lot in very, very territorial species where one male might have a large range of territory where he is the only individual there. You'll also see this in plants that need an extraordinary amount of resources. Some cacti will do this. Clumped is much more common. Things that are alive tend to cluster in groups, be that animals living together for security, or plants that are clustered because the seeds can only travel so far from the parent plant, and so they end up in a cluster or a clump. The last is not very common in nature, but there are some species that distribute themselves randomly. Dandelions are a good example of this. Those seeds just catch the breeze and they go anywhere. They can live in very rough patches of soil, so there's really not a lot of pattern or rhyme or reason to that distribution or dispersion. Really quick before we wrap this part of the lesson up, I want to talk quickly about minimal viable populations. It's something we consider in conservation. It's something that you could think about after going out and sampling and figuring out what size a population is. But this would be that minimum number of individuals that a species needs to continue survival. And there's no one magic number because it has to do with the genetic diversity within the species, threats to the species, and some species just need a lot of individuals in their social structure to maintain an existence. And a great example of that is the passenger pigeon. There are so many stories of the passenger pigeon in the 1800s in this country where they would literally just black out the sky. There were billions of them. They would form these huge nests in trees. They were very, very, very easy to catch for food. So people would just go out with clubs, or then there was firearms. And so by the late 1800s, they were declining rapidly. Nesting sites that had been common places to find them were declining or disappearing, and by 1914 the species was completely extinct. Billions of organisms in the species to extinct in less than 100 years. And so it's really a cautionary tale for us as humans, because we have great technologies now that allow us to catch most of the individuals of a species, like our fishing technologies and things like that. So it's something to consider. Luckily, we have zoos doing great jobs of, keeping some of our large mammals and amphibians and reptiles. They're making sure that we have a good breeding population still in place, and so there will be more on conservation to come, but that's it for now.